Chapter 11, Journey to the Lights. Many months had passed since Rick and I had heard this story of Grandfather's trek into Death Valley, and the impact of that lesson stayed so strong in our minds. Certainly we learned the lessons of heat and thirst, but more so, we learned that Grandfather never really knew or understood the desert until that day in Death Valley that he had almost died. This, in a way, shocked us because Grandfather had been to the deserts many times before that trek to the Valley of Death. Yet just being there those times did not guarantee that he knew the deserts at all, and he was open to learning more. Most of all, it was obvious that Grandfather's many quests were more important to him than his own life. He dedicated his life fully to the quest, no matter what the cost. The lessons of the waterfall in the desert were only part of the story, however. The final teaching was not to come for Grandfather until years later, when he wandered the farthest northern reaches of the continent. Only when he finally faced the northern lights were the lessons complete. Thus the lessons of fire and ice, water and rocks, came to fruition. The ice of the far north held the final key to his search for what he considered living. It held the wisdom of pure survival without struggle. He had faced the waters of the jungle, the fires of the desert, and now he had to face the treacherous cold of the north, learning in each instance to accept nature on its own terms and live by its rules. Most of all, each lesson taught him to redefine the consciousness of what was truly living, not just what was spiritually alive. It was in the dead of winter when we heard Grandfather's story of his trek to the north. We had been living in a survival situation for the better part of a week during our Christmas break from school. We were hit hard by bad weather. It had snowed heavily shortly after we had built our shelters in the earlier part of the week, and now the latter half was wrapped in a deep freeze. Rick and I were having trouble functioning at all. We waited until the warmer parts of the day before we would venture out from camp, and then not very far. During the morning and through the night, we became prisoners of our fire, unable to go very far except to collect firewood. We had not yet mastered body control and had not fully learned to remove the power from the cold. As usual, Grandfather seemed to be wholly unaffected by the severe cold. Each morning, without fail, he would go down to the stream to bathe. He did nothing different in the bone-chilling cold that he wouldn't do on a hot summer day. Grandfather was no more bothered by the severe cold than he was with the heat and torturous thirst. I know that he had explained to us many times before the factors involved in his ability to withstand the elements, but I knew that there had to be more. I had seen him use body control to the extent that he could enter chilling waters and actually sweat. He told me numerous times that he would not allow extreme cold or heat to have any power over him. I knew that was but half the answer. His attitude and absolute serenity were such that it transcended even body control and even the power of the cold. As usual, as we watched Grandfather bathe from the safety of our fire, we both felt so angry at ourselves. I knew that I had a lot to learn about controlling my body, and I wasn't sure as to how to remove the power from this storm, but I wanted so desperately to do what Grandfather was doing. I imagined all the wondrous things that he was doing and the rapture he was feeling as I huddled close to my tomb of fire. I could see no resistance in his actions, only total acceptance. There was no struggle or fight, not even a goosebump or small shiver. To me, it appeared as if he were part of the cold and not separated in any way from its power. In essence, he seemed to become the cold and thrive on its power. The more I watched him, the more determined I became to ask him to give me more answers to the wisdom of the cold. In my mind, the cold was even more powerful than the heat and thirst we had felt on our long summer walk. At least then we could eventually quench our thirst in the waters. Here, the fire was barely keeping us warm. I could not imagine bathing as Grandfather was doing, far less venturing very far from the fire. I became obsessed, overwhelmed by wanting to know his secret. I suspect, in retrospect, that Grandfather had planned many object lessons such as this. He would coax our curiosity to a point where we wanted to desperately know something. Then, and only then, would he teach us, for he knew that we were then fertile ground for the seeds of wisdom to grow. Our obsession to learn would then drive us through all manner of obstacles. That night, after a long and cold day of watching him wander about in the cold, he told us the story of his trek to the northern country. Shortly after Grandfather left the Death Valley area, he began to feel a calling to wander up the West Coast. It was not a definite call to any specific location at first, but a general feeling of direction. He had been along the entire West Coast several times before, but he suspected that his inner vision was driving him to some unseen lesson yet to be learned. Yet he felt there was no rush, not like there had been during his trek from the waterfall to the desert. Instead, he just wandered leisurely, learning and enjoying. The only time that any driving force would hit him was when he lingered too long in one place. He spent several months in the Northern California area, alone with the giant trees. He always loved the serenity and wisdom that he found any time he lived for a while in this area. It was a time for him to relax and to be introspective, sorting out many of the lessons he had learned during his visits to the waterfall into Death Valley. To him, the trees held unbelievable wisdom and power, wisdom about the past, and more important, wisdom about the future. He could talk freely and openly to the trees, and they to him. As always, he was humbled by their awesome size and power. They were mystical giants that held the wisdom of the ages and could change men's souls. There he purged himself with all the nagging little questions that still haunted him regarding his most recent lessons. There, too, he grew strong again. He was beginning to grow content with his camp in the Redwoods, and in fact was thinking about staying there through the next season when the calling to go on hit him again. This time it pulled him stronger than it had when he first left the desert. Now not only was it giving him a direction, but also a place. He knew that he had to return again to the North Country, where the lights dance in the sky. He had been there several years before and spent a good part of the summer season there with a small group of Eskimo people, and now he knew that this was the place he had to go. He was delighted that he would be visiting his friends again, but with the oncoming winter, he wondered how he would survive the trek into the village. So, too, did he wonder if these people could still be found in the same place. After all, the last time he visited them was in the summer, at their summer camp. He hoped that he could find their winter camp, but resolved himself to allow his inner vision to guide him. Grandfather continued his trek up the West Coast, still not in any great hurry. He knew that it would be many months before he even got close to the Northern Territories, and as yet the calling still did not dictate a fast pace. During his journey, he would encounter people who lived along the coast. There he would stay for a while and learn some of their ways and skills. Though he would avoid most encampments and villages, there were a few that he felt he was drawn to. Several of the people along the coast he knew very well, for he had visited them many times before, and they had become old friends, eager for his company and to share their wisdom. Yet even during his visit with his friends, the inner calling would not permit him to stay for very long. He had to keep going north, and there was no doubt in his mind that he would not arrive at his destination until winter. He knew then that this calling was not only directing him to a particular place, but also dictating a time that he had to be there. He found that whenever he tended to rush the trip, that his inner vision would slow him down to a point where he just had to stay put for several days. It was almost as if the trip were being solely directed by a force beyond his own will. If he went too fast or too slow, this directing force would make his life miserable. His spiritual mind would not give him any peace unless he followed the directions inwardly given. He learned long ago during his early childhood that it would be almost suicide to go against any of those spiritually directed forces, so he subsequently obeyed them without question or a second thought. Sometimes these spiritual thoughts directed him to a specific location along his route of travel, as if to prepare him for what lay ahead. One particular incident took him by surprise, especially after the encounter was over. He had been directed far off his route along the Canadian coast. Instead of heading north, as the calling originally dictated, he felt a command to go east, far inland. This confused him for a while, and he had to camp for several days to make sure that was a true spiritual compelling. He could not understand why, after directing him for so many miles north, the force would suddenly have him change direction. Assured that it was correct, he unquestionably headed east, deep into the lush coastal mountains. He traveled for 2 days, but had no idea as to where or why he was going. At times his inner vision seemed to abandon him, leaving him with a deep sense of being lost. Yet every time he made a slight direction change, the force would awaken and guide him back to his original path. He traveled like this for a few days, though the pace was still relaxed and time did not seem to be a factor. However, he felt that he could not tarry for very long in any one camp. He awoke in the morning and was immediately on his way, traveling non-stop until fatigue forced him to camp again. Finally, he wandered into a small valley, and he knew somehow that this was his destination. Traveling up the valley, he suddenly came upon a small and very old cabin nestled among the northern valley wall. It appeared to have been there forever. As soon as he saw the cabin, he knew that he had arrived at the destination that the inner calling had dictated. At the same time, he also knew that this was only an intermediate stop along the path of his greater quest. He approached the cabin carefully. At first glance, he could not decide if the cabin was owned by a Native American or some old hermit. Such was the way it was built, with the evidence of both cultures. He could plainly see a wisp of smoke coming from the old and battered stovepipe, so he assumed that someone was living there. He did not want to walk right up to the cabin, for many times people were very protective of their land and did not like strangers. Instead, he approached the cabin very carefully, stopping frequently to try to pick up any evidence of people being about. He studied the tracks that led to and from the front door, from a good distance away. He knew then that there was only one person living there, and that, from the last set of tracks, the occupant must still be inside. He could also tell that the tracks were made by an older man, probably older than he. They also revealed that this man was very aware of what was around him, truly a child of the forest. Yet he still did not know if this old man was from the world of the white man or from the world of the Native American. After a long approach with frequent stops, he decided that he could feel no hostility around the cabin. His inner vision told him that there was no real danger, so he walked leisurely up to the door. As soon as he was within 5 feet of the door, an old voice called to him from within the cabin, telling him to come in. It also told Grandfather that he had been waiting for quite a while for him to get there. This startled Grandfather, for the old man had known of his approach long before he had arrived at the cabin. So, too, did the old one know when he was within hearing distance from the door. Grandfather was surprised at this, for very few of the people that he met in his travels possessed any skills that could even come close to the awareness of this old man. Even those people who still live close to the earth could not come close to what this old man had known through his observations. It was miraculous enough that the old one knew of his approach, but he had done so within the confines and insulation of the cabin. Grandfather was truly amazed as he walked in. As Grandfather opened the door, he saw the old man sitting at a rather weathered and rustic table. In fact, the entire cabin was rustic and hand-hewn. There on the wall was an old musket that looked as if it had not been touched for years. So, too, were there many handmade items, and most possessed a Native American ancestry. There was little in the cabin from the outside world. It became apparent, at a glance, that this old man was totally self-sufficient. The old man also fit perfectly into the motif of the cabin. He wore the worn and battered pants of the white race, but he also had on high moccasins and a buckskin shirt. His wrinkled and weathered features were that of the white man, but his white hair was long and worn in braids. On his buckskin shirt were several old quillwork designs that were once carefully made but now falling apart with age. The old man smiled at Grandfather and motioned him to come sit at the table. Though Grandfather did not like to be inside cabins or to sit on chairs, he did not want to offend the old man. The old one poured some tea into a handmade wooden bowl and handed it to Grandfather with a broad smile. To Grandfather's delight, it was a pine tea and not the typical blend that one would buy from the trading post. Without hesitation, the old man told Grandfather that he was probably from the deep southwest part of the country, guessed his age, and even came close to identifying Grandfather's people. He also told Grandfather that he could see Grandfather was truly a child of the earth and definitely now on a spiritual quest. Grandfather was absolutely speechless at what this old man knew of him. To Grandfather, this old man reminded him of his great-grandfather who had raised him. Such was the old one's sense of awareness and keen observation skills. They talked well into the afternoon. Grandfather was held captivated by the old man's wit, charm, and awareness. It wasn't long before Grandfather also found that this old one was deeply spiritual, knowing many of the things that Grandfather knew about the spirit world. This deeply shocked Grandfather, for it was rare indeed for any white man to possess the spiritual skills that this old one maintained. Grandfather felt that this old man was even more attuned to the earth than most spiritual people. And it wasn't long before Grandfather realized that he was in the presence of a white shaman. This was even rarer indeed, for he had never encountered a white shaman before, at least not one of this caliber. Grandfather and he exchanged many stories and found that much of their lives were along similar paths. Both were wanderers and searchers, looking for a common truth, a simple truth. Both worshipped the Great Spirit in the temples of creation, and there had grown close to all that was natural and spiritual. The old man told Grandfather that in his latter years he had searched desperately for someone to teach, but the world would not listen to what he had to say. Now all he wanted was to live out his remaining years here in the bosom of creation, away from the world of the white man. He was heartbroken that all of his knowledge would die with him, and he feared that someday the consciousness of society would destroy the world. The old man felt so helpless in his attempt to try to stop what could be the inevitable destruction of life as he knew it. No one wanted to listen. Grandfather, too, felt this way. Many times he would try to teach what he knew, but no one seemed to want to learn the old ways or the wisdom of the Spirit. He too felt so helpless, and he feared that all of his searching, all accumulation of knowledge would be in vain. Unlike the old man, however, Grandfather was not going to give up and live alone. He knew that someday, somehow, these old ways of skill and spirit would be passed down. He did not know why, but he felt that the things that he was learning were not only for himself, but for the world. The old man had fought a valiant battle to try to pass down what he knew, and he still tried, but now he had grown too old to continue his quest. However, he told Grandfather that he was still learning and would not give up his quest to learn until the Great Spirit took him to the spirit world. By the end of the day, Grandfather and the old man both felt that they had known each other for decades. Grandfather was truly amazed at the old man's spiritual ability, so too with his spiritual knowledge. He had never met anyone that he considered to be equal in his observation and awareness in many years, and it was so good to have someone who understood and could talk to him on his own level. Grandfather spent the next several days with the old man, sharing his knowledge and learning. They spent many days walking along the various woodland paths around the cabin. Grandfather found that the old man would know where an animal was even before he did. It became a game to them to see who could spot an animal first and farthest away. This contest would keep up from one day to the next, and the score would fluctuate frequently. Always at the end of the day, it would be a tie score. Grandfather noticed that the old man did not seem to pay attention to the animal tracks and trails that laced the area. Grandfather thought that this was odd because anyone who was a keen observer of nature and was that aware should also be very aware of tracks. In Grandfather's mind, there could be no separation between awareness and tracking, for they were both the same thing. He just could not understand why so much on the ground was overlooked by the old man. He did not know if it was by choice or accident. He asked the old man why he seemed to pay no attention to the tracks and was struck speechless by the old man's answer. The old man told Grandfather that he had been blind since birth and that the only way he could track was by feeling them with his hands. Grandfather was truly amazed, for there had been no indication in the old man's mannerism or walk that told of his blindness. It baffled Grandfather that this old man could be totally self-sufficient, so aware, and travel as much as he did in his life in total blindness. Grandfather marveled at the old one's ability, which in fact humbled Grandfather. Grandfather just imagined all the obstacles this old man must have overcome in his life, and how utterly easy Grandfather's quests were compared to the ones this old man had to face in total darkness. Grandfather could not understand why the old man had considered his life such a failure. It was a success enough just to be able to take care of himself. He did not have to teach anymore, for he was an inspiration to all, especially now to Grandfather. The next day, Grandfather prepared to leave the old man. Grandfather told him that he would forever be his inspiration, and that he would teach others of what he had accomplished despite being blind. Grandfather said that it would be through him that the old man would see his vision of teaching live, for the lessons that Grandfather had learned from him would forever be part of him and his teaching. Without any goodbyes, Grandfather walked away, down the path and toward the coast once again. There was a sadness, because he knew he'd never see the old man again in the flesh. Certainly, there would always be a spiritual connection, but Grandfather felt that he was losing a father. Such was the strength of their friendship and love. Tears filled Grandfather's eyes, and he waved a last goodbye from a distant trail. He smiled when the Old One waved back, for the Old One could not see Grandfather, only sense him. He was held in awe once again. Within a few days, Grandfather was at the coast again and heading north. Still his trek was not rushed, but the call still guided him. He wondered to himself about the deeper lessons he had learned from the visit to the old man. He knew that there had to be more than just the inspiration of the Old One. After all, the directing force that he was following led him there for a reason, and he knew he would have to resolve himself to accept what he had learned and allow the rest to emerge as it was meant to. Still, the thoughts of the old man would not leave him. Each time a certain sadness would follow, but he did not know why. Several days had passed since Grandfather had left the old man's cabin, and thoughts about him diminished. One night, as Grandfather slept by his open fire, he had a dreamlike vision of the old man walking up the mountain. He could plainly see the Old One nearing the upper ridge, a ridge that was composed entirely of light. In his dream, the old man turned to look back down the trail he had taken. Grandfather saw him smile at him for a moment, wave, and then walk into the light. Grandfather awoke with a start, sweating and trembling from the vivid impact of the dream. At once he knew that the old man's vision was finished, and instinctively he knew the Old One had died. The loss he felt was so overwhelming that he sobbed for a long time, until dawn's light dried away his tears. Could it be, Grandfather thought, that the old man was kept alive just long enough to pass something on to him? Now that the wisdom was exchanged, it was time for the Old One to take his final walk to the light. Grandfather felt humbled by this thought, for though there was no evidence for what he felt, the Old One seemed desperate to pass on his knowledge to Grandfather. Again, he wished that he knew what the deeper lessons were. Without truly knowing if he may be dishonoring the old man's vision, he swore to himself that he would try to understand all the lessons that the old man had passed down to him. To give nothing less than his full attention to those known and unknown lessons, Grandfather would only defile the old man's life and memory. For the next several days, Grandfather decided to camp and devote his full attention to the old man's teaching. He actually went against the directing force that was pushing him northward, for he felt the lessons were more important right now. He did not feel that he could go on until at least he had tried to find the deeper lessons. The driving force kept pushing him harder and harder as he lingered, and thoughts of the old man grew more faint. Eventually he could not concentrate on the old man's vision for very long without being distracted by the calling of the north. It was as if he had to go on, or the calling would not let him think at all. It was on a walk in the misty morning hours that Grandfather saw the old man standing on a distant northern ridge, beckoning him to come. He knew that now the old man called him again to the north, and he had to go without knowing the secret of the old man's vision. By the time Grandfather was halfway through Alaska, winter was setting in. Still the voice was calling him onward to go further north. This began to frighten Grandfather, for he knew that he would eventually get into the tundra area where the trees ended. With the ever-deepening snows, this would be a struggle. At best, it would be very difficult to build any kind of permanent survival camp. Temperatures would be at a killing level, and he could make no mistakes, for even the slightest miscalculation would certainly cost him his life. Still, he obeyed the calling to go on, even though he knew that it might mean his life. In the final days, the calling pulled him stronger, now rushing him along his journey. It would permit him very few rests, and his camps were now always rushed. There came a point where he could not go onward without snowshoes, and it took him several days to make them. The whole time the calling voice nagged at him to hurry. Finally, after what seemed to be an endless trek, he came to a place where the calling subsided, then disappeared altogether. He knew then that he was where he was supposed to be. There was no question, though he did not yet know why he had been led to this place, nor what lessons were about to be learned. He just busied himself making a permanent camp before the land was fully locked into winter's grip. His camp was located midway along a finger of timber that reached out into the tundra. It was the last place trees could be found, and the only place he could safely camp. Anything out on the far reaches of the tundra would be suicide. Within a few days he realized that it was not the tundra that he camped near, but along the shores of a frozen and snow-covered lake. The tundra lay far beyond and to the northern horizon. Yet he knew this was the place he had been directed to without a doubt. So, too, was the task of survival made easier for him. In the forest where he had chosen to camp, there was an old, broken-down hunter's cabin, and with a little patching, it made a warm shelter. In fact, it was more of a shelter than a cabin, made most entirely with crude tools and lashed together with rawhide. Grandfather spent the next several days collecting food and firewood before the furious storms of winter locked him in. So, too, would the deeper snows cover almost all food sources, so he had little time for anything else than to gather and prepare. Usually he was so tired when he was done for the day that he slept solidly. No thought was really given as to why he was there or what he was going to do when he had finished his preparations for the day. He was in a dead race against the oncoming of severe cold and heavy snows, and there could be no time to relax and be introspective. That would be a luxury he could not afford. Very few people lived this far north, and those that did had long since prepared for the oncoming season. He felt so alone and isolated in his struggle. As his camp began to take shape, and all the chores of putting food by were taken care of, Grandfather finally had time to relax and enjoy the frozen landscape around him. He began to observe the local wildlife and marveled at how easily they seemed to survive. The ptarmigan were of a special interest. To him, these birds looked totally unconcerned and unaffected by the severe cold weather or the deep snows. They needed nothing for a bed other than to burrow right into a snowdrift and become part of its whiteness, totally safe and camouflaged from everything. He marveled at these little birds and how frail he seemed in comparison. After all, they needed nothing to survive here, for they were part of these frozen lands. He, on the other hand, needed all manner of food and tools to barely scrape out an existence. As the days slipped by, he knew that the ptarmigan of the frozen places were like the lizards of the desert. Both belonged, and both were part of it all. He began to accept the frailties in himself, resolving himself to the fact that man needs tools to survive. Unlike the ptarmigan, who needs nothing to survive here, he needed everything, and somehow that always made him feel alien to this place. It was depressing to Grandfather to think of himself as being an alien to all places because of the need to make tools. Realistically, he thought, the only place that a man could survive without making anything would be in only the warmest and luscious places on earth. At that moment, though he felt a certain peace about living in such a cold place, he still felt a little removed and alien. He also wanted to become part of things, like the ptarmigan was to the frozen places, and the lizards to the deserts. He spent days exploring his little stand of trees, the frozen lake, the snow-covered hills, and the tundra beyond. He found that even though he still felt like a poor survival risk and an alien, there was no struggle. As he learned on the desert, he had to obey the laws of the frozen tundra and become part of that law. It delighted Grandfather to know that he had taken the lessons of the desert and now applied them to this wilderness. Here he looked again at the whole as a living entity, not just spiritually alive, but physically alive. By understanding the consciousness of this place, he became part of that consciousness, and by doing so, his mind was also composed of ice, snow, and cold. He felt closer, but still he wished to be as the ptarmigan. What confused Grandfather was that he did not know why he had been led here to the tundra. There was no struggle, and he easily accepted the living consciousness of this wilderness. He knew that there had to be more, but the lessons at hand were not as clearly defined as those of the lizard of the desert. He began to grow impatient, feeling that he should possibly struggle before he arrived at any future answer. Yet the thought of making this into any kind of a struggle seemed impossible. At this point, everything was so easy. The only thing he could possibly do was to take a vision quest, but even that would not be all that difficult. Somehow he knew that the answers must lie in the wisdom of the ptarmigan, though he did not know how to find that wisdom. One night he was drawn into the center of the lake. He sat there on the edge of a frozen snowdrift for a long time, gazing out into the distant sky. The northern lights danced their intensity like he had never seen before. They illuminated the entire lake, making everything dance with their own play of light and shadow. He gazed at the sky, held in awe. The beauty was almost unbearable, and tears began to fill his eyes. Suddenly, this barren and frozen place became more alive than he ever imagined. He took notice of the blowing snows gathering around him and the deep cold. He soon became part of the drift, never taking his eyes from the dancing skies. He felt so alone, wishing that he could share this magic with the world. The isolation of this far northern lake filled him with sadness, for this show would truly go unseen by anyone, even many of those who called this place home. It was then, when he felt so alone and isolated, that he noticed a tiny little glistening black dot in the snow next to him. He could see the reflection of the northern lights glistening in this little dark pool of water drop. He stared at it for a long time, trying to decide if the image was real or imagined. Then it moved slightly, and he found that the little dark pool seemed to be looking back at him. He suddenly realized that he was looking into the eyes of a ptarmigan that was nestled in the snowbank right next to him. Like him, the ptarmigan was watching the northern lights and watching him. The feeling of aloneness and isolation suddenly dropped away. In the eye of the ptarmigan, he saw a friend, a searcher of beauty and simplicity like himself. The ptarmigan was also finding unspeakable beauty in the lights, and the bond was forever formed between them. Grandfather wandered back to his camp, wrapped deep in thanksgiving for the lessons shared by the ptarmigan. He now felt as if he were accepted in this place, though as he reached his shelter, the feeling of being an alien returned to him. His shelter appeared to him as that which separated him from this place and the oneness he wished to achieve. He longed to be able to do what the ptarmigan had done. It was then that he remembered something the old blind man had shown him, a lesson that fulfilled the reason for his journey here. It was the image of the ptarmigan's eye that made him think of it. A ptarmigan's eye that he had seen once before with the old man. At the time, the lesson did not seem all that important, but now its full impact came hammering home. Grandfather remembered walking in the woods near the old man's cabin when they came upon a dead ptarmigan. The old man said that a friend of his tried to raise ptarmigan, but the attempt became futile, and many of them escaped from captivity. The old man told Grandfather that these birds could not survive in this part of the world because they needed the cold tundra areas. The old man told Grandfather that he had found most of the birds dead during the past summer. Grandfather remembered looking into the frosted eye of the dead ptarmigan, feeling a sense of loss and sorrow. He knew that the bird was out of his element, and survival for him would be nearly impossible. The bird was truly alien to this landscape and weather conditions. Grandfather suddenly felt elated because a big question had been answered through that ptarmigan. All of this time, Grandfather understood that mankind was a poor survival risk, and because he needed his tools, he was alien. But now Grandfather saw the need for those tools not to be a liability, but a blessing. It was through the tools that man could go anywhere he wanted and enjoy the splendor of nature. He was not confined or alienated from any place, but as long as the rules of nature were obeyed, he was free to wander, while so many other animals could not. No, it did not make Grandfather feel above the animals or the laws of creation, but finally it made him feel like part of it all. Yes, man's need for survival tools were still a liability, but at the same time a blessing. As long as the rules were obeyed, then man would not be alien. As long as he understood the living consciousness of the land, there would be no struggle. Within a few days, Grandfather left his Arctic camp and the wisdom of the ptarmigan and headed back to the coast and eventually south. He wandered for many months, now with no real driving purpose other than to explore. It felt good to him to have a reprieve like this from the learning and searching process, especially from the driving voice that had been with him for over 2 years. As he wandered back along the coast, the driving force hit him again, calling him once again to go inland. Without a doubt, Grandfather knew where the voice was telling him to go. He was headed to the old man's cabin again, yet he knew in his heart that the old man would not be there. At least he could pay homage to the place and honor the old man's memory in prayer and ceremony. It took several days to get to the cabin, and to Grandfather's surprise, there was smoke coming from the old chimney. The place definitely looked as if it was still lived in. Grandfather quickened his pace and walked right to the cabin door. Even before he could knock, a voice told him to come in. It was not the old man's voice, but a younger voice. Yet it contained the same sense of knowing and awareness as had the old man's. Grandfather opened the door to find a young man sitting at the table. He wore buckskins that had been decorated with quill work. He smiled up at Grandfather and told him to sit down. Grandfather was spellbound by this young man, for he seemed to have many of the mannerisms and much the same awareness as the old man. Grandfather stayed with the young man for several days. To his amazement, the young man, called Ben, was the great-nephew of the old man. Ben told Grandfather that he used to spend many summers in this place, but the lure of the city had taken him away for a while. He said that his search had now brought him full circle, and he wanted to follow in his great-uncle's footsteps. He wanted to preserve and pass on the old one's wisdom. Grandfather realized then that the old one's vision was now living, and he had gotten his wish. On the day that Grandfather left, Ben said that he had a gift to give him from his great-uncle. With that, Ben handed Grandfather the feathers of a ptarmigan and said that his uncle had told him that Grandfather would know what they meant. Tears filled Grandfather's eyes as he walked away. I looked at the ptarmigan feathers in Grandfather's braid and finally understood their significance that had eluded me for such a long time. Rick and I were held spellbound by Grandfather's story. No, it did not make it easier to take the cold of the night, but it did open up a whole new way of thinking about man and nature. I, too, had seen the tools of survival as a liability, but now looked at them as a blessing. So, too, was I beginning to reconsider what I thought to be living and non-living. Everything had a living consciousness, the sum of all its parts. I, too, was part of that consciousness. That night, the fire no longer felt like a prison, but that which freed us to enjoy this place.